Well, I am smoking cigarettes because I am beyond sick today. Although the sickness will end probably about 45 minutes to an hour after 11:45 tomorrow. I could probably explain that in greater detail. 45 minutes to an hour after 11:45 tomorrow. Something interesting. For years and years, probably, I don't know, at least 100 years, maybe a little less, at least within my lifetime and a little bit before, they found who these Philistines were, these sea peoples. Um, I think the common assumption is that they're from Sardinia, Sicily, some type of Italic people, Italy, whatever. People have said that they were the Greeks getting kicked out of Italy, that they were Italic peoples getting expelled from the from the uh, from the Etruscan expansion, then the Romans fighting against the Etruscans, and the Greeks getting fighting the Romans they picked up and left. Another theory is that they were the people of Thera before it exploded and turned into Mycenae, or no, Thera before it exploded and turned into Santorini. And they also say that this is what caused the biblical plague. Okay, I'll concede the fact that I do think that the explosion of Thera accounts for the events that we see in Exodus. Every single last one of them. I think Simke Jakubowicz in his documentary on decoding the Exodus does a pretty good job at showing that such a volcanic disaster will cause the 10 plagues that's shown in Exodus, if not all in order. Or we just see that some of these plagues actually come simultaneously or in groups of like 4 or 5. But they're all there. You're not missing one of them. Even the release of lethal gas that just floats along the ground. And he showed where the firstborn slept in the lower part of the house and everybody else slept on top, showing that the firstborn would have been killed. And also along with the animals. They've seen this in Africa a bunch of times where just underneath the water there was a lethal gas waiting to come up, and the first sign of its expulsion is the water turns blood red, and then the next day this fog comes across the land, only is about 2 feet high, suffocates everything, and then goes away. So that people actually sitting up eating and not laying down wouldn't even notice it. They would just watch it go by. And the same thing for the account of this angel of death that would go through. So we're actually looking at something historical interpreted through the eyes of people who saw things very mystically. Again, when you're reading something from history, you have to look at how would somebody at this time view this, how would they interpret it. But you have to be a detective, basically. But there's one thing that I don't think gets explained, and maybe I should back up at this point. There's the groups. One of them is known as the Tjekkers. These were thought to be the Philistines, but there's an even closer link with the Philistines with these people, because the Tjekkers wore tassels on their clothes, just like we see the Israelites being commanded to wear tassels on the corner of their clothes. Um, I had a list of sea peoples right here, and I don't know if I can spot it or remember when I try to go back and find something. This is why I do no research. The Peliset. The Peliset are believed to be the Philistines, because you have the Pelistet set, the Tjekker, uh, uh, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. These were seen to be a confederation of them, although there are about 20 different groups of sea peoples. A documentary called the Secrets of the Secrets of the Agean Apocalypse show that the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, and the Hittites all fall around the same time. And when I mean the same time, I mean boom, within a few years of each other, if that. And that there's an actual tablet that was being fired to be sent off to this prince's king, this prince's father, saying, "Look, we've seen about 7 of these ships right off of our shore. If you see any more, send word." And the whole city was destroyed without even the thing being fired. And that archaeologists dig it up. And that Crete, we find 80 settlements on western Crete that had been abandoned. Same time they had been abandoned, there had been these basically Masada-like citadels built on the precipice of these high cliffs, so that people could only get up there one at a time, and they couldn't be carrying a weapon. Very precipitous climb. Now, I look at that further. I always thought the wandering in the wilderness, coming from Islamic background, 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years, just meant a lot of time. But why are the Israelites sticking around in the wilderness, not going in and settling any land? Why are they kind of waiting in the wings? Maybe these natural events showed them, hey, let's get out of here. And again, you have to remember, when I was always brought up, God didn't do miracles. Miracles weren't attributed to God. My dad always taught me miracles aren't attributed to God. But he gives people foreknowledge to help them. He'd point to the story of Joseph for this. That this horrible famine was going to happen anyways, but to prepare the people for it. That God is not somebody who comes down and meddles in doesn't do miracles, but he grants people glimpses into the future of how to take care of these things. So why wander around for 40 years? 40 meaning many. I don't care if it's 100 years or 20 years or many months. And the same time we see, and scholars have already known that what they call the Philistines before Abraham and what they call the Philistines after Moses actually are two different people, and this can be demonstrated in archaeology, that it was a history being written looking back. The Philistines were not an indigenous Canaanite people. They were what's called a Greek people. So remember, when you say Greek, that goes all the way from Sardinia to Sicily. Sicily was Syracuse at the time, so definitely was a Greek. Much of Italy and the Greeks. These people also get called as barbarians. But this Agean Apocalypse shows them as the same people as the Hittites and the Egyptians. Auxiliary barbarian troops that would wear no armor, just a headdress, carry a javelin, and they would clear the field for the for those on chariots and the archers that were also. You'd have two men on a chariot. You'd have one with basically the sickle sword, and then you'd have an archer. But what if you had an overwhelming presence of these auxiliary troops that just had javelins? You could easily overtake the chariots. And it seems that that's what happened. And that no one fought with these grand chariot armies anymore. That it was infantry, and they switched from these sickle swords and archers and javelin throwers to basically moving armies of infantry. And you might have a cavalry with that, but that's about it. So you see a whole type of warfare ending. Not to mention, you see three civilizations collapsing, and Egypt being crippled and not coming back to its great glory pretty much ever again. So who are these Tjekkers? And let me just lead you through just a group of them which hit the Levant. Oh, we see the people coming after the Hittites, which are the Ekwesh, the Terahat, the Luka, the Sheridan, and the Shekelesh. But these Philistines had occupied Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Anybody who reads their Bible knows this. And even archaeologists of our day, I remember an archaeologist asking him, oh, right here, let me show you something. This is just right off of YouTube, right here. They're not YouTube, Wikipedia. The campaign of 12 years is attested by the Sudsteli, found in the south side of the temple. It mentions the Tjekkers, the Peleset, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, and the Shekelesh. This is what's seen in the Egyptian reliefs. And the Egyptians did drawings along with hieroglyphs. They did relief scenes. And the funny thing about these people is that they're dressed exactly like these auxiliary warrior bands, these auxiliary troops that would clear the field after the basically hit the death blow to the chariot riders and the archers after they had fallen, because the chariot riders and the archers wore armor. So the Peleset, the Tjekkers, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, whenever we see these in the relief of these sea peoples attacking Egypt, one thing we find is they're not wearing body armor. They're carrying javelin, and the only thing they have is a headdress. Now go look back at these auxiliary troops that they were using. What the Agean Apocalypse proposes is that these people were being used for this, and it was a peace treaty signed. It lasted about 80 years. So where's the work for these people? They're out of work. And that after so long, they say, wait a minute. All of these great empires are reducing their armies. This is a great period of time where there's all this merchandise flowing. Nobody has to live under the idea of threat. It almost reminds me of, since I know my thing is the late Roman period. The late Roman period is something near and dear to my heart. But what do we see? We see there's auxiliary troops being used that kind of don't need to be used anymore. I mean, the Huns had already kind of gone away and just had settled their own land, and we don't need these Goths and Vandals and to be, to be teaching them all of the Roman warfare. And then the Huns come back. The Huns actually go east, and these mobbing, seething people called the Goths, who have been mistreated, overflow Rome. And then we see the Vandals. And then there's no stopping anybody. Who's going to fight the Germanic people on the Rhine? The Rhine freezes over. The lighthouses go out after 410, and these people just cross the Rhine. There's nobody keeping them at bay. Look at the way they believe that the Tjekkers had settled Dor, and that the Peliset are the Philistines. Now remember, these are just groups and names, basically these barbarians, but they're probably not all that different, one and the same. They're probably all very similar people, using the same technology. It's just how the Egyptians had grouped them, and their way of life is different. I remember archaeologists talking, and they said, well, so these Philistines, were they eating sorry, my Greek is bad, or at least my modern Greek is atrocious. Were they eating sloufaki, or were they eating hummus? And they said, no, they're definitely eating sloufaki. Okay, gambler, you're gonna need crap about that one. Were they drinking ouzo, or were they drinking wine? Not wine. Let's get something more Greek. Sloufaki. Yeah, I can't. I have a hard time pronouncing Greek words. So, wait, I think I can narrow it down. Were they eating? You get the point. Were they essentially Greek? And when I mean Greek, I mean Magna Graecia. I mean going all the way from Sardinia to the Mediterranean, or were they a desert people? Would they like to ride on ships or camels? And it turns out they definitely were what we would call Greek, even if they weren't from, Athens or Sparta. And we see the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, and the Hittites all get wiped out at the same time, and that Egypt gets crippled. What historians call a Dark Ages emerges. Out of the Dark Ages, we find democracy grow in Athens, because there's not any superpowers anymore. We find many people attribute the Trojan War to this period. We also see that the kingdoms of Solomon and David could arise. Well, how is that possible, since you got a Canaanite kingdom right there with Canaanites, Hivites, Jebusites, these people who had very similar culture, worshipped very similar gods. And to the north you had the Hittites, which would come down and rule a large part of that. And you had the Egyptians, which of course took about half of Canaan to use as a buffer zone. And even in the Bible, even after this had fallen, the Egyptians still thought that this was part of their land. They'd still go way up they'd stop around the Negev and fight. They didn't, this was their doorstep. Now, these sea peoples weren't really pirates. These were not, people might have a misnomer that they would fight on the sea. No, they actually were useless until they hit the land. Once they hit the land, they could bring out their javelins, and they didn't need all that many people. They just needed maybe two, at the least 200, at the most 500, to just overrun. What's the only way to stop them? Well, actually, surprisingly, we have something that's almost a frozen photograph in time, which the Egyptians had left us, which is these people, the Egyptians pouring out of the delta, meeting these people in the sea and just decimating them with bows and arrows. These people couldn't be formed in a rank and file and start throwing their javelins and basically rushing, as fast as they could on foot. And they could just be picked off and dispersed. And after this fight, the Egyptians erect this huge stone stela where they actually give a good depiction. They make pictures of these people, how they looked. And one of them is these Pelisets and Tjekkers. They have fancy headgear with these weird feathers on one of them, on I believe the Peleset or Tjekkers. They have no body armor. And what are they carrying? A javelin. Now, if you read the accounts in Kings, what are the Philistines like? Do they have huge armor? I mean, they may have a few people on chariots, but it's not these whole war chariots things. And an easy place to take would be Palestine, since it's a hill country. I mean, if you read the battles of Deborah and Jael and Jael's husband, I mean, it's all has to do with who has the higher ground and running and everything. So I think we found who the Peleset, Tjekkers, Denyen, and Weshesh are. Oh yeah, and Shekelesh. Surprisingly, we find these names are very, very close to some of the settlements that we find in Palestine, since that was the majority Egyptian and Hittite area, and the Egyptian and Hittite just pulled back. The Egyptians had to pull back almost all the way halfway into their kingdom, and then set up a new capital right at the delta. They couldn't use Thebes anymore because they needed to be ready for when these people attacked. One theory is that this long era of peace, 60 era of peace, let these barbarian runners that would basically be, kill the charioteers as they were knocked off their horses, because the charioteers wore armor and they couldn't run fast. These people were now out of work, which I think is a very interesting hypothesis. But obviously I'm not going entirely by that, because again, not only is it the late Roman period that I'm interested, and also the beginning of the Roman Empire, which I'm extremely interested. The first part of history I got interested in was the rise of the Roman Republic after they defeated Tarquinius Superbus, also known as Tarquin the Proud, and the great queen Talia or Thalia of the Etruscans. I love looking at these people. These people seem to be amazing to me, and especially their society, how they constructed. That's why I say Latin for Italian people, just for generic Italic people. But we have to remember there are Samnites. There are all these other groups of people, which I generalize into Latin, since most of the ancient ethnologists just group people into things like that, But if you look at these names, now Simki Yakubovich, who I take with a grain, some of his stuff I think is absolutely brilliant. Some of the other stuff I think, wow, that's a great stretch. He notices a people called the Danoi when the ancient Israelites are leaving, and even throughout Exodus, Joshua, and Judges, and even in Kings, it talks about the Danites, who Homer records similar people known as the Danoi, who actually steal the Helen of Troy. That these Danoi, they said, well, who's going to fight and this and that when they're trying to figure out who in the Judges period is going to fight. Well, these Danites are in their ships. We know these weren't a seafaring people, but they came from land, that they were in their ships. This is right before this invasion of sea peoples, and right before this dark ages that comes. Well, Homer describes them as Danoi, and right here we see Denyen. And what do we know about Dan? Dan was considered an apostasy. They were considered people who left, who basically gave up their identity in being a people of God, and that they were bull worshippers, which was very common for pagan Mediterraneans. So they say, well, we'll take our chances going by sea with these people. We can make riches. And what do we see with Gideon and Ehud and all these other people is that there's not huge power structures. These are chaotic lands with all these different peoples in there. Who's the emperor? Who's the king that rides over all? And this is an area that's just a little bit away from Egypt. It's just south from the Hittites. And we see Hittites are still around, but they're not the huge force that they were before. They were kind of just the people who descended from the Hittites. Because if you know anything about the Hittites, these were people who would, when they actually had a huge empire, they would surround a city, kill everyone, and stack all their skulls outside. And you could say, oh, they ripped that off from the Assyrians. Very, very effective tool of war, psychological warfare. Another thing they find out in Crete is that there's 80 settlements that are abandoned. And what happens to these 80 settlements? Do they go away permanently? No, these people start building. And some people say, oh, it was because of the earthquakes and tsunamis. It was through earthquakes and tsunamis. Why did they build these basically tiny citadel village towns on the extreme edge of rocks that could just be shorn off at a big earthquake? And that the only way to get to them is a weaving path where you have to cling to it with all four appendages. You couldn't be carrying a sword. You could only come up one by one. And it would only take about 6 people, 6 guys, just to be throwing stones down on top for these people to be dispersed. So you have these barbarian auxiliary troops which don't get named individually, but just get a name, a group name, and then a number of how many they were. And they're displayed in battle they're these runners alongside the chariots. And they have a headdress to identify who they were or which group they were with. They wear no body armor, and they carry a javelin. About 100 years later, these people show up wearing these fancy headgear, no armor, and javelins. Now, after this period where the whole disruption in the chariots happened, what do we see? We see massive infantries, because these people find out we can defeat chariots very easily. If there's just enough of us with javelins, we can take out chariots and archers. The one thing they couldn't do is if they were stuck together on boats, they were useless. So the Egyptians went out just past their delta into the open water, just took their archers and just decimated these people. And after this, the Egyptian reliefs went up, and the Tjekkers settled a city called Dor in Canaan. And this is recorded in the Hebrew Bible. And that these Pelesids show up the same time as Joshua is coming in to Canaan. And the judges are coming into Canaan, and they're fighting this out. Because where's the superpower of Canaan at this time? You look in the archaeological record and you see Chemosh, Hadad. You see a whole different spectrum of gods. Well, who are the gods that the Canaanites bring in? Dagon. Yes, they use Baal. But was Baal a Hebrew name? Because Jezebel's grandson actually forms Carthage. And all of these gods seem to be related to each other. I should do a video on the difference between the Greek gods and the Roman gods. But even these Canaanite gods have counterparts that we could call Greece in Greece or in Rome. After all, Saturn is Kronos. Mot is either Hades or Pluto. Hades and Pluto are the same god. Kronos obviously being Saturn. And El being Kronos. And it gets kind of strange that how do these, if you have these different peoples, which how different really were they? They have the same pantheons. Could it be that we attribute a lot to Sardinia and the Fertile Crescent? But could it be these Sardinian sea peoples? Because whoever said Sardinia and the Iberian Peninsula, that we now call Spain, were just nothing. They were just savages, even though apparently Hercules had traveled all the way to Spain, it being called the Pillars of Hercules. We saw these adventures with Sardinia. Syracuse is right there. We know Syracuse, which is now Sicily, was a thriving Greek colony. Pythagoras was from there. These people knew how to travel. So I'll go into the next time. But I think this Agean Apocalypse theory gives a great theory. But I think you need to gather it with multiple other views. And I think it becomes very obvious. Because one of the greatest questions was, where are the Philistines coming from? Because very early on they realized the Philistines, that people get called Philistines at the time of Abraham, really aren't the Philistines. These are people looking back and saying, oh, well, these enemies, and they're calling them Philistines. And the Philistines weren't a Canaanite people. They were a people that showed up around the same time as these Israelites were coming into their territory, because they weren't friendly with the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Hittites. These were another group of people. And if there's Hittites wandering around without a kingdom, what happened to the Hittite kingdom? So I love history. I love archaeology. The more we know, the better grasp of our past we have. This is when people say, well, the Bible is totally myth. How could you possibly believe the thing that comes out of the Bible? When it matches up every other ancient record. And it's not matching up exactly. It's finding commonality, common enemies. Nobody's going to make up an enemy that had just destroyed their land and is weakening them. But I think that from what I thought, that the 40 days in the desert was just, obviously 40 days is only figurative. 40 is figurative. It just means many. That may have been the reason they were waiting for these, for both the sea peoples and the indigenous peoples to weaken themselves so that they could come up. Now, I'll add in a conspiracy theory. We knew the Israelites were living in Goshen, right? And that the Egyptians got worried about them, saying, well, if a foreign invasion comes, they might fight with them. Were the Israelites grouped in with the sea peoples? Take it easy. Peace to you. May God save Serbia and Syria. People have said that they were the Greeks getting kicked out of Italy, that they were Italic peoples getting expelled from the from the uh, from the Etruscan expansion, then the Romans fighting against the Etruscans, and the Greeks getting fighting the Romans. They picked up and left. Another theory is that they were the people of Thera before it exploded and turned into Mycenae, or no, Thera before it exploded and turned into Santorini. And they also say that this is what caused the biblical plague. Okay, I'll concede the fact that I do think that the explosion of Thera accounts for the events that we see in Exodus. Every single last one of them. I think Simke Jakubowicz in his documentary on decoding the Exodus does a pretty good job at showing that such a volcanic disaster will cause the 10 plagues that's shown in Exodus, if not all in order. Or we just see that some of these plagues actually come simultaneously or in groups of like 4 or 5. But they're all there. You're not missing one of them. Even the release of lethal gas that just floats along the ground. And he showed where the firstborn slept in the lower part of the house and everybody else slept on top, showing that the firstborn would have been killed. And also along with the animals. They've seen this in Africa a bunch of times where just underneath the water there was a lethal gas waiting to come up, and the first sign of its expulsion is the water turns blood red, and then the next day this fog comes across the land, only is about 2 feet high, suffocates everything, and then goes away. So I am smoking cigarettes because I am beyond sick today. Although the sickness will end probably about 45 minutes to an hour after 11:45 tomorrow. I could probably explain that in greater detail. 45 minutes to an hour after 11:45 tomorrow. Something interesting. For years and years, probably, I don't know, at least 100 years, maybe a little less, at least within my lifetime and a little bit before, they found who these Philistines were, these sea peoples. I think the common assumption is that they're from Sardinia, Sicily, some type of Italic people, Italy, whatever. So that people actually sitting up eating and not laying down wouldn't even notice it. They would just watch it go by. And the same thing for the account of this angel of death that would go through. So we're actually looking at something historical interpreted through the eyes of people who saw things very mystically. Again, when you're reading something from history, you have to look at how would somebody at this time view this, how would they interpret it. But you have to be a detective, basically. But there's one thing that I don't think gets explained, and maybe I should back up at this point. There's the groups. One of them is known as the Tjekkers. These were thought to be the Philistines, but there's an even closer link with the Philistines with these people, because the Tjekkers wore tassels on their clothes, just like we see the Israelites being commanded to wear tassels on the corner of their clothes. I had a list of sea peoples right here, and I don't know if I can spot it or remember when I try to go back and find something. This is why I do no research. The Peliset. The Peliset are believed to be the Philistines, because you have the Pelistet set, the Tjekker, uh, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. These were seen to be a confederation of them, although there are about 20 different groups of sea peoples. A documentary called the Secrets of the Secrets of the Agean Apocalypse show that the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, and the Hittites all fall around the same time, and when I mean the same